What I find very interesting in looking at the work we're doing at the RSA and the work we're doing at NEF is seeing how lots of different pieces are building up a bit of a picture. But first I sort of just want to go back to my work at NEF, because at NEF I ran the program that was looking at banking and finance and money. And one of the most important, I suppose, pieces of understanding that we had there that we used to promote and still do is that money is not a thing. Money is not gold. It's not an object. Money is a relationship. Money is a social relationship. And that once you have that different understanding of what money is, that actually it's just a way of governing relationships between people, it really changes the way you think about the economy and the way the economy works. So I guess for me, and you heard from the intro, I was once upon a time a banker, and what I did was move money around. And as an accountant, and I counted money, but we never actually understood what money was doing those professions. I had to figure that out for myself after I'd left those jobs in disgust in 2000. But so the idea that money is a social relationship is sort of one step that I've taken towards this idea of thinking about what the solidarity economy is. And there was another important step for me, and I was delighted when I saw Jay Tomt walk in the building. So there was a moment with me when I spoke at the Local Entrepreneurs Forum in Totnes, which is an initiative of Transition Town Totnes, organised by Jay. And I gave a talk there in May 2015 about a Bank of Devon, and it was all about the importance of having locally based banks, regionally based banks that served the community. And we don't really have those in the UK, apart from something I'll mention in a minute, but we don't really have those, but they have them in other countries. So I gave the example of the Bank of North Dakota. So there's a US state that has a state-owned bank, and this surprises quite a lot of people in this country. And I asked, well, why can't Devon have its own bank? And one answer is, but Devon's not a state, it's far too small. It turns out that North Dakota has a population that's slightly smaller than the county of Devon in England. And I like to sort of posit that as saying, these things are attainable. It is not impossible to think that there could be a cooperative bank or possibly a public savings bank just for Devon. So I was giving that talk, and again, this is sort of a piece, I think, for me, of what social solidarity economy is. But I gave that talk about a week after the general election. Now, I've been working in policy think tanks, and I am working in a policy think tank now, but that's not the only thing we do is policy. We also look at other ways to change the world. And the point I want to make about giving that talk a week after the general election is that there was an expectation from a lot of the people in that room at the Local Entrepreneurs Forum that would have had a Labour government by that point, and that would be a vehicle for achieving lots of progressive social outcomes that everybody in that room wanted to see. But all of a sudden that option disappeared because there wasn't a Labour government, those manifesto promises weren't going to materialise. And I think that's quite an important lesson, because actually, should you be relying on politicians to deliver this stuff? Should you be thinking that policy is the way to achieve your social objectives? Well, I think it's important, and power analysis tells you that where power lies, you need to address that power, and there is power wielded in Westminster. But what about the power that is wielded in the everyday transactions that happen in the economy? So, money is a social relationship, community banks that serve the population. And if you can, instead of thinking of a way that you have the economy over here and you can tax that and you can use that revenue to achieve collective benefits and services over here, you're always going to run into trouble. What you need is an economy that inherently is wired up to deliver good social and environmental outcomes. And that, in a way, is what a lot of the work of NEF was, and that is, I think, what the work of the RSA is. So I'm just going to pick out some projects that we're doing that I think are relevant to this. Before I do that, though, I sort of said something old and something new is the title of the talk. So I was thinking, of course, there is nothing new about the idea of economic institutions that are owned and governed and serve communities more directly, right? There's nothing new about that. And so the RSA is a very old institution, right? We were founded in 1754. And like all good things in those days, it was founded in a coffee shop because there was this wave of drug taking swept over the UK. We discovered this new drug called coffee. And people started forming institutions. That's what they did. And the RSA was, in fact, so it's an enlightened institution, right? It's a product of the Enlightenment, rationality, throwing off the mysticism and strict class structures and religion and so on convey. But it's also about individualism, really. So that's the RSA found at that time. And that was about social progress. Now, 1776, a fellow of the RSA called Adam Smith published a book called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, which I'm sure you've all heard of. A seminal moment in, some think that's the founding of modern economics, or classical economics, actually. So that happened in 1776. So you think, well, okay, this is moving in a direction which is all about markets, self-interest. You know, Adam Smith's insight was individual self-interest in a market can deliver good outcomes for all. Well, it's an important insight. But in 1775, the year before, something that is less well known but possibly more important happened. And that was a publican in Birmingham called Ketley formed the first building society based in the Golden Cross Tavern. And that was a way in which ordinary workers could club together and hope to be able to build houses for themselves. Because that certainly wasn't going to be forthcoming from the economic system that Adam Smith was describing. So parallel systems. Fast forward to the next century, and in 1844 something else very significant happened, and a piece of legislation was passed in the UK. There was the Joint Stock Companies Act. So in 1844 you have, for the first time, a company that's a legal person, that is allowed to write contracts and act as a legal person. Very important in developing the economy, but also this is about those joint stock companies are generally held by people with wealth, right? That's who is forming them. But in the same year, something else equally important happened, and I know there are historians of the cooperative movement in this room. But the Rochdale pioneers formed their first cooperative retail, their shops. So in an environment where private shopkeepers were selling, you couldn't trust basically the goods that you were buying, right? There was the idea of a cooperatively owned shop where you could trust it because it was owned and run by the community that were the customers. Happened in the same year as the Joint Stock Company. I also want to just bring in a little Canadian reference here in this transition of events. So I guess what I'm saying to you is that at the same time that we've got the development of the thing which we see out there is very powerful, a modern capitalist neoliberal economy. That's the thing that is totally visible. But quietly, and sometimes quite noisily, but along the way there has always been an element of economic organisation that has been around solidarity, that has been around people coming together and owning it themselves and running it themselves. My reference to Canada is going to be, and apologies if I pronounce this wrong, and this is due to a colleague called Josie Warden that I work with that's been telling me this story. But in 1885 in Canada, there was a certain practice of First Nation peoples that was outlawed called the potlatch. And this was a way of, in traditional management of resources, where prestige came to people in accordance with how much they gave away, not how much they accumulated. But that's a very, very difficult thing for capitalism to swallow. So that was actually outlawed. But you have to wonder now, what could we have learned and what can we still learn from the way that natural resources were managed in that way by First Nation peoples in common? There's a lot we can learn. And that's always been there. And again, the history of economics, like most histories, is written by the victors. So the way that we learn economics now as economics students, it's almost as if this modern capitalist Western creation of an economy based around private property is the only natural form you could possibly conceive of. That's nonsense. It's not natural. It's not natural at all. And it's not the only form you could conceive of. So what you can take from that is it doesn't matter what the way the economy is wired up now, we can change it. It is something constructed socially by people, by us. We have the power to redesign it and change it. That is within our power. So let's, as one more little event I want to mention before coming to the current projects, and then that'll be me. But in 1970, two really important things happened that you need to be aware of. Right? The first is I was born, so that was a good year. But secondly, a guy called Milton Friedman wrote an article in which he expounded I don't even want to call it philosophy, creed of shareholder value, where he said that anybody that was managing a company and did anything other than aggressively pursue the maximum profit in that company was doing something, or he almost cast it as being immoral, as being sort of appropriating resources, stealing resources from the shareholders. Now, this has since been proved to be legally nonsense. Shareholders don't own companies. Shareholders own shares. Right? Companies have lots of stakeholders. This is enshrined in law in many countries, including here. But that myth of shareholder value has almost driven 40-odd years of a type of economic organisation that has only cared about profit. Or has it? Because what else has already been around? So this is where I'll sort of conclude, about what all the pieces are. Because, for a long time, I've mentioned banks, we have had credit unions. A massive movement globally, not so big in the UK, but still present. And credit unions are a form of cooperative that deal with saving and lending. That's part of the social solidarity economy. We've got now community currencies and time banks that are growing as a movement. That's absolutely, understanding the social quality of money and wanting to repurpose the way money works. We've got the community land trusts. Now that has a long pedigree in this country. It's never been massive, but it is growing. And I know there are experts on the panel who will talk more about that. But I think it's very exciting what is beginning to build in the community land trust sector. And we have all sorts of, so I'm going to talk about one sector which we're working with the RSA, and we're calling this, or we don't call it, but it's the community enterprise sector. So we have a program we're running for the Power to Change, which is a lottery-funded organisation. It's a leadership program for people running community businesses. Now, the way that's defined is a community business is one which pursues both social and financial value. So it's looking to be financially self-sustaining. It is a business, but its purpose is to create the social value. It is also place-based, a community business, so it only makes sense in the context of where it is. It's not something you could take that and just move it somewhere else. It is absolutely tailored for the circumstances of its community. It's place-based. And the third important aspect of that is that the community itself participates in the business in some meaningful way. It might be that they might have votes, they might own it, they might be involved in the delivery of the services very intimately. And that's something that's been described now as the community enterprise sector in the UK. And it's interesting, it's growing. It's growing fairly quickly. It spans a lot of sectors. You've got everything from the community renewables sector, which has grown very quickly in the form of community shares. We've got social care cooperatives. We've got asset transfers from local authorities who have been under a lot of pressure. The good ones, the visionary ones, are making sure that they don't just sell their assets to the highest bidder, but they make sure they transfer them to community enterprises who can make the best use of that asset to create social and financial value. And so we've been working with this sector, and we don't call it the solidarity sector, we call it the community enterprise, but I think it's a piece of the puzzle. And there's three traits of this, three qualities that I think are very interesting that I want to share, because I wonder how widespread this is as features. The first feature is that for us this is practicing a different kind of democracy in action. This sector. So a lot of people might suggest that democracy feels a bit broken in this country, possibly some other countries, particularly a big one over the pond. I don't know about Canada, but your southern neighbour's not looking too healthy. But democracy, okay, what is democracy? Democracy is a vote every 5 years for an MP or a councillor. It's got to be more than that. It's more than even just deliberative democracy and getting involved in policy. Democracy is participation in the economic institutions in your life too. And the more that people experience this by getting involved in community enterprises, I'm curious about the way that might reshape the way that we feel about democracy in general and the level of accountability and transparency and control we are willing to demand out of the whole of the rest of the economy, not just the bit that we're in charge of. The second interesting feature of community enterprises is, for me, that they are human scale. What I mean by that is whenever something grows too big, you have to create a bureaucracy to manage it. And bureaucracies can often be inhumane. And it doesn't matter whether it's a public sector bureaucracy or a private sector bureaucracy for me. If it's too big, it can be inhumane in the way it treats people. And that's because it's too big. Community enterprises are always human scale. That's the way they're built. They're built around a community to serve a community. And so that remoteness, that inhumanity, it's very hard for that to creep into that model. It's a good safeguard that it's human scale. And the third thing is very related to that, and this is possibly the most subversive thing about community enterprises for capitalism, which is in the title of this event. And that is, it doesn't seek to grow forever. Community enterprises want to reach the right size to fulfill their purpose, and then they stop. Yeah? You just need to be as big enough as you need to be. Now this is the way the rest of nature grows. It grows until it is big enough to fulfill its purpose in nature. Otherwise, in the nice Neff cartoon, you'd have hamster that was as big as the planet in sort of 15 weeks if it grew exponentially, right? So things grow to the right size, and that's what community enterprises do, and then they don't have to grow anymore. But that is quite subversive, because I once heard at a conference on sustainable business, somebody questioned the chief executive of a large drinks company. So what do you think, how do you think capitalism can adapt to the limits to growth? Well, I've never seen anybody so confused at a conference in my life. Right? So, this executive of the big global soft drink, I won't say which one it is, but a big global soft drinks company, just sort of looked bewildered and said, but capitalism is growth. Couldn't conceive of a system where you could run a company and its only sort of raison d'etre was profits and growth. And funny enough, mainstream businesses are now increasingly talking about purpose, and they're talking about their mission. But I haven't yet heard anybody on the FTSE 100 or out of the Fortune 500 say, do you know what, we're just going to get big enough to serve our purpose and then we'll stop growing. That really would be a turn up for the books. So these are things, but luckily this already exists in this other universe of community enterprise. We can already see how to run that. We can see what a future economy could look like that could not burst over environmental limits. So the final question I have, and this is a question because I don't know the answer, which I want to leave for everybody to think about, is I am interested in how all these pieces become a movement that actually then adds up to something very powerful that we can see and creates a change. What I don't know is whether naming it would help or not help at this point politically. Because I know there are lots of examples of very enthusiastic local conservative politicians and politicians of all party raving about a local community shop or a community land trust or a credit union. Very, very supportive, very often. I think if you introduce the word solidarity into that, they might run a mile from it. But I don't know. And this is a genuine question. I'd really like to know, but I'm going to ask you all individually after in the networking what you think about it, because I don't know. But what I do know is whether we call it anything, I think that there is a movement building, and that is exciting, because that is a vision of a way that you can run an economy so that it is wired, the economy is wired to deliver you good social and environmental outcomes. And hell, that's what we need. So thanks very much for listening.